It is a September evening in 1944, somewhere in the Reich. A German soldier, exhausted, hungry, and fighting a war he no longer believes he can win, sits hunched over a small radio set. The front has been contracting for months. His unit has lost men he knew by name, men he trained with, men whose letters home he sometimes helped to write. The Eastern Front is a slow catastrophe. Normandy has opened a second wound. And now, in the flickering light of a dugout somewhere east of the Rhine, he turns the dial, searching for something familiar, something German. He finds it. The station is called Soldatensender Calais, Soldiers Radio Calais. It plays music he recognizes, swing and popular tunes, the kind of thing broadcast on proper German military stations. The news bulletins sound authoritative. The voices speak in his own dialect, with the cadences of home. He relaxes, he listens. He does not know that the broadcast is coming not from Calais, not from Germany, not from anywhere within the Reich at all. He does not know that it originates from an underground bunker beneath the heathland of Ashdown Forest in Sussex, England, or that the transmitter powering it is the most powerful medium-wave broadcast transmitter on Earth. He does not know that everything he is hearing, every carefully chosen word, every subtle whisper of defeatism between the jazz numbers, has been designed by British intelligence to corrode his will to fight. And then, one evening in the autumn of 1944, the music stops. A voice comes out of the static, a voice that cannot possibly be there, a voice that every German soldier, every Nazi official, and every civilian from Berlin to Munich has been told is dead. Ich bin General Oberst Ludwig Beck, it says. I am not dead, as has been lyingly and prematurely reported by the spokesman of our traitor rulers. This is the story of Aspidistra, the machine that made the dead speak. The transmitter that Britain used is to wage war not on the bodies of German soldiers, but on their minds. It is the story of a weapon built not from steel and explosive, but from radio waves and lies, and the particular genius of one man who understood that the most powerful weapon in any war is not the one that destroys the enemy. It is the one that makes the enemy doubt everything he has been told. To understand why Britain needed such a device, you must understand the information landscape of the Third Reich. From the moment Hitler consolidated power in 1933, Joseph Goebbels and the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had built the most comprehensive system of information control the modern world had ever seen. The Volksempfänger, the People's Receiver, was a cheap, mass-produced radio set deliberately manufactured to receive domestic German frequencies and little else. By 1939, over 16 million of these sets were in German homes. A further 8 million more capable receivers were in circulation. The Nazis understood radio in a way no government before them had. It was not simply a means of communication. It was a tool of reality construction. If every voice a German citizen heard spoke the same language, confirmed the same narrative, repeated the same certainties, then dissent became not merely dangerous but literally unthinkable. Information was so tightly controlled that even battlefield reverses could be managed, delayed, reframed, or buried entirely before the public learned of them. The British were acutely aware of this problem as the war began. Traditional broadcasting, the BBC's European service, which broadcast factual news to occupied Europe, was valuable. But it was openly British, openly Allied, openly the enemy. Any German soldier or civilian caught listening faced imprisonment or worse. More critically, the very fact that a broadcast came from London meant it arrived pre-labeled as propaganda in the mind of its intended audience. It had to overcome its own origins before it could deliver any message. What Britain needed was something entirely different. Not a British voice speaking to Germans, but a German voice that Germans would trust, one that sounded as though it was emerging from within the Reich itself. The concept was not new. It had a name: black propaganda. The challenge was technical: to broadcast a signal powerful enough to sound as though it was originating inside Germany, transmitted on the same frequencies as legitimate German military stations, required a transmitter of almost unimaginable power. Nothing the British possessed in 1941 came close to being adequate. The solution arrived from an unexpected source. In the United States, a company called RCA had built a transmitter of extraordinary capability, originally intended for the American broadcaster WJZ in Newark, New Jersey. The transmitter produced 500 kilowatts of output power. To give some sense of scale, most commercial radio stations of the era operated at between 1 and 50 kilowatts. The BBC's own domestic transmitters ran at between 100 and 200 kilowatts. This single machine, sitting in an American warehouse, was capable of bathing virtually the entire European continent in signal. It sat unused because the Federal Communications Commission had imposed a 50-kilowatt limit on all American broadcast stations. The transmitter had been built, tested, and then shelved, a technological marvel with nowhere to go. The British Secret Intelligence Service acquired it for £165,000, a significant sum, but one that bought them something priceless. The machine was shipped across the Atlantic, crossing U-boat-infested waters at considerable risk. The aerial, which required 3 guide masts, each standing 110 meters tall, roughly the height of a 35-story building, was lost when the vessel carrying it was torpedoed. Engineers had to rebuild it entirely from scratch. The transmitter itself was installed not in an ordinary building, but in an underground bunker excavated by a Canadian Army construction unit beneath Ashdown Forest near Crowborough in Sussex. The bunker housed equipment of extraordinary complexity: the transmitter itself, its cooling systems, its power supply infrastructure, and the rapid retuning mechanism that would make the whole system viable as a deception tool. The engineer responsible for this last feature was a man named Harold Robin, a technical genius who solved what had seemed an insoluble problem. Standard medium-wave transmitters of the period required several hours to retune to a new frequency, as engineers physically rearranged crystals within the system. Robin designed a mechanism that allowed Aspidistra to change frequency in a fraction of a second, as quickly and smoothly as a listener turning a dial. The name came from a music hall song. Gracie Fields had recorded the biggest Aspidistra in the world in 1938, a comic number about a houseplant of improbable proportions. Someone in British intelligence clearly appreciated the joke. The transmitter went into service on the 8th of November, 1942, and it was, for a time, the most powerful broadcast transmitter on Earth. The station it was primarily designed to power was called Soldatensender Calais, Soldiers' Radio Calais. The whole operation ran out of a requisitioned estate in the village of Milton Bryan in Bedfordshire, surrounded by barbed wire fences, guardhouses, and German shepherd dogs. The man in charge was Dennis Sefton Delmer, journalist, linguist, propagandist, and psychological warfare genius. Delmer had grown up in Berlin, spoke German natively, had met Hitler personally before the war, and understood the German military mind with an intimacy that no British-born intelligence officer could have matched. Soldatensender Calais went on air on the 14th of November 1943 and remained in operation until the 30th of April 1945. Its formula was elegant in its simplicity. Delmer described it as cover, cover, dirt, The overwhelming majority of any given broadcast was perfectly legitimate material. Swing music, jazz, football results, weather updates, news relayed directly from the German News Bureau, the official Nazi press agency, which Delmer's team intercepted and monitored every day. A tired Wehrmacht soldier turning on the wireless late in the evening would hear something that felt indistinguishable from an authorized German military radio service. And then, buried within hours of comfortable, familiar programming, came the dirt. A brief mention that a particular general was known to be siphoning funds, a casual reference to the venereal disease statistics among the officer class. A warning, delivered in the concerned tone of a fellow soldier, that confidence men were operating on troop trains between France and the Eastern Front, targeting soldiers being rotated between theatres, stories of supply shortages, of party officials living in luxury while frontline men starved, of wives and sweethearts at home whose faithfulness could not be guaranteed. None of it was shouted. None of it was presented as revelation. It was murmured like camp gossip, like something a man might share with a friend. The station was so convincing, so technically accomplished, that Joseph Goebbels himself noted it in his diary with unconcealed alarm. What disturbed Goebbels was not simply that the British were broadcasting to German soldiers. It was that the station was good. German soldiers trusted it, even when word spread, as it eventually did, that Soldatensender Calais was a British operation. Many soldiers continued to listen. The music was better. The news was more honest, and somewhere in that contradiction lay the deepest damage the station could inflict. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. There is considerably more to come, but it was a different operation, one that tested the outer limits of what psychological warfare could achieve, that gave Aspidistra its most disturbing hour. On the night of July 20th, 1944, a group of Wehrmacht officers attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. The bomb exploded. Hitler survived. The conspirators were arrested, tortured, and executed with brutal efficiency. Among those the Nazis declared dead was Colonel General Ludwig Beck, once chief of the German General Staff, one of the most senior officers in the Wehrmacht, a man whose moral opposition to Hitler had led him to resign his post in 1938. When the July plot collapsed, Beck attempted to take his own life and was reported dead, shot in his own headquarters. The story of Beck's death was broadcast across Germany. The conspirators had been caught and destroyed. The Reich was safe. The Führer lived. Sefton Delmer's team saw an opportunity of extraordinary audacity. What if Beck were not dead? What if, somehow, a voice were to emerge from the ether, deep, authoritative, unmistakably that of a German general, announcing that he had survived? That he had been carried away, wounded by friends, that from hiding he was calling on the German people and the German army to resist? On an evening in September 1944, the Aspidistra transmitter unhooked itself from the Soldatensender Calais schedule and seized a temporarily vacant German frequency. What followed was, in Delmer's own description, one of the most extraordinary broadcasts of the entire war. A deep voice emerged, resonant, slow, commanding, and it said, "Ich bin General Oberst Ludwig Beck. I am not dead, as has been lyingly and all too prematurely reported by the spokesman of our traitor rulers. When, on the night of the 20th of July, I was compelled to go through the act of shooting myself, I did not die. I was only wounded. Friends carried me away, pretending I was a corpse." For any German soldier tuning in at that moment, already exhausted, already questioning, already listening to a station his commanders told him was dangerous, this was not merely surprising. It was genuinely, viscerally unsettling. The voice of a dead man, a general who should have been a corpse, speaking from the darkness of the ether, calling the war criminal The operational impact of this particular broadcast is impossible to measure precisely. Records from the period are fragmentary, and the German military censored reactions as a matter of course. What can be assessed is the cumulative effect of the Soldatensender Calais campaign as a whole, in which the Beck broadcast was only the most spectacular moment. Aspidistra and its associated operations were also used for a quite different kind of deception, one with more immediately measurable consequences. During the RAF's night bombing campaign against Germany, particularly during the Battle of Berlin, German radar stations broadcast the movements of Allied bomber streams to guide night fighters onto their targets. The transmissions identified which sectors the bombers were in, gave height and bearing, and directed German fighters accordingly. Using Aspedistra's extraordinary power and Harold Robbins' rapid retuning system, German-speaking RAF operators began impersonating these ground control transmissions. A British operator would cut into the German frequency and issue contradictory instructions, directing night fighters to land, to divert, to search the wrong sector of sky. The operation was called Dartboard, and its results were tangible. Bomber crews reported nights when the fighter response seemed confused, when aircraft that should have found them never arrived. The Germans adapted. They changed their procedures, introduced authentication codes, began using female operators on the reasonable assumption that British military signals intelligence would be staffed by men. The British response was to bring in WAFs, Women's Auxiliary Air Force personnel whose German was fluent enough to impersonate Luftwaffe communications operators. The Germans changed again. The British followed. It became an electronic arms race conducted in real time, across frequencies invisible to the naked eye, while bombers and fighters searched the same dark sky overhead. The United States never developed a direct equivalent to Aspidistra, though American psychological warfare operations grew substantially more sophisticated as the war progressed. The Office of Strategic Services ran its own black propaganda campaigns, including Radio 1212, a station broadly similar in concept to Soldatensender Calais. American operations tended, in Delmer's slightly sharp assessment, towards greater spectacle and less sustained subtlety, where the British approach had been to corrode trust slowly through months of carefully measured cover dirt. The American inclination was to dramatic coups, the fabricated uprising of a Rhineland town, the staged Gestapo drama broadcast from Radio Luxembourg. The Soviet Union operated its own German-language propaganda station, the German People's Radio, which was explicitly inspired by, and in part modelled upon, Soldatensender Calais. The Soviets, however, lacked the technical infrastructure to replicate Aspedistra's raw broadcasting power, and their output was considerably less convincing to German ears. Germany itself had pioneered the concept of sophisticated radio propaganda. Lord Haw and Axis Sally were both attempts to achieve in English what Soldatensender achieved in German. They failed, largely because they fundamentally misunderstood their audiences. Haw was plummy and condescending. Axis Sally was heavy-handed. Neither attempted the patient, painstaking mimicry of domesticity that made the Soldatensender feel real. The Germans could not make a British station sound British because they could not build the human infrastructure required. The defectors, the native speakers, the granular cultural knowledge that Delmer assembled at Milton Bryan. How much did it matter? The honest answer is that quantifying the psychological impact of any propaganda campaign is extraordinarily difficult, particularly across 80 years and the archival gaps left by a regime that destroyed records as it collapsed. What can be said with confidence is this: By the spring of 1945, Allied intelligence reported that Soldatensender Calais had become one of the most trusted and widely listened to radio sources among German soldiers. Goebbels himself assessed it as damaging to morale. Internal Wehrmacht communications warned units to avoid it and were, by all accounts, largely ignored. The station closed on 30 April 1945. The same day, Adolf Hitler died in the Berlin Führer bunker, without announcement, without ceremony, without a final broadcast. It simply fell silent. The Aspidistra transmitter was handed to the BBC and continued in service for nearly 4 more decades, broadcasting the external service to Europe in peacetime until it ceased transmissions in September 1982 and was dismantled in 1984. One of 3 RF output coupling coils from the original Aspidistra transmitter is preserved today in a museum collection. A small piece of copper and engineering that once carried the voice of a man the whole of Germany believed was dead. The bunker at Crowborough still exists, though it now serves considerably more mundane purposes as a Sussex police training facility. The Milton Bryan estate where Delmer's team worked, the recording studios, the barbed wire perimeter, the collection of German-speaking refugees and defectors and cranks and characters that one dismissive Foreign Office official had once sneered at, is marked today by a historical plaque. Not many people stop to read it. Return, then, to that German soldier. He is sitting in the dark. He is tired beyond easy description. He has been at war for 5 years. He has lost friends and watched positions he believed were permanent dissolve under Allied pressure. He turns the dial and finds a voice he trusts, playing music he knows, saying things that feel true. He does not know the voice is coming from England. He does not know that every word has been crafted by a German-speaking journalist who met Hitler in the 1930s and decided with full clarity that he would spend the war making other Germans doubt the man he had watched seize power. He does not know that the subtle despair being dripped into his ear, measure by careful measure, is not the natural consequence of a war going badly, but the deliberate work of a team of psychologists, writers, linguists and engineers working in a requisitioned country house in Bedfordshire. And then the voice of a dead general speaks to him from the void. The bullet and the bomb end a man's body. The voice in the dark reaches for something harder to defend. It reaches for certainty, for the belief that the world is as one has been told it is, for the trust that the voices in the ether are the voices of one's own side. What Aspidistra and Soldatensender Calais achieved at their most profound was not merely the undermining of German military morale, it was the colonization of the German information environment itself, the successful insertion of a British consciousness into the space where German soldiers went to feel at home. Every hour, a German soldier spent listening to music chosen by British intelligence was an hour spent inside a fiction constructed by his enemy. Every detail he absorbed, every half-belief in corruption among his officers, every gnawing worry about the faithfulness of distant wives, all of it arrived through the same channel, carried on the same waveform, delivered by the biggest Aspidistra in the world. Sefton Delmer's verdict, written after the war, was characteristically unsentimental. He did not claim that Aspidistra had won the war. He claimed only that it had contributed to hastening the collapse of the German military and social apparatus, and that this was enough. The most powerful weapon in the Second World War did not fire shells. It broadcast at 600 kilowatts from beneath a Sussex forest, and it gave the dead their voice.